AC, we are going beyond Hammerland again. And this month, June 2019, what the heck? 2023. I was thinking of 1999, which is when the remake of this movie we're going to be talking about today came out. But we're not talking about the remake of The Haunting. We're talking about 1963's The Haunting, which turned 60 this year. And guess what? You and I, both of us, have birthdays today, June 30th.
That's correct. Happy birthday, Ian.
Happy birthday to you, AC. We're going to talk about The Haunting and a little bit of behind the scenes business, some entertainment for you folks out there. We're going to be well rehearsed in this conversation because we just talked for a half hour before I press record. So let's keep this fresh. Let's get this going, and let's talk about The Haunting, directed by Robert Wise. I have a bit of history with this movie. I did see the remake in '99. I hated it. I watched about maybe an hour of this film, several years before that, kind of on a couch cuddle date, like, hey, let's watch a scary movie in the dark. And I fell asleep. So yeah, that kind of, and I got to say, my reaction
that speaks more to your date or your movie. I'm not sure.
I'm not going to put this on the date at all. It was all movie and mostly me, I think, or my reaction to it, because this is a beloved classic horror film that in watching it for the first time for this show, I had to put on in 3 separate installments because, again, I kept getting distracted, falling asleep. This is like the definition of a slow burn film. And I'm hoping that at one point I will be able to watch this in its entirety. I have to wait till it comes to a theater maybe and go see it. So no excuses.
Well, since we've got that, we're actually going to be screening this film on the big screen at the Sulzer Public Library in Chicago. So I'll send you some information to put in the comments, but yeah, if you want to come and see it on the big screen, August is going to be the time to do that right here in Chicago.
Whoa.
I will be hosting a screening of it.
Oh my gosh. We didn't talk about this. See, this is fortuitous. We didn't talk about this in the previous conversation. That's great. Okay.
Anyway, the big screen experience awaits you.
All right. Well, because, and I know you are a big fan of this film. We've been talking kind of around it for a long time. And so we finally found a place for it here on Beyond Hammerland. Now, I do want to say that Robert Wise is one of my favorite directors. He is a director who has worked in basically all genres. In addition to this, he did The Day the Earth Stood Still, West Side Story, Star Trek: The Motion Picture, numerous other films. Actually interviewed an author of a book about Robert Wise's career a couple of years ago. I'll have a link to that show down in the comments, or the description, I guess. So yeah, big fan. This is the only movie of his that I've seen that I don't think I really liked. It's not because of the direction. It is because of, I think, the central performance and issues I kind of had with the screenplay. So AC, why don't you kick us off with a quick summary?
Well, we've got 4 main characters that are taking up most of our time in the film. Dr. Mark Way, who's played by Richard Johnson. He is he's exploring the supernatural. He's kind of investigating, and Hill House has a rather notorious reputation for being haunted, which we'll talk about in a minute, kind of like the events that lead up to the present day. We have Claire Bloom playing Thea, and she is a psychic, and he has recruited her. He's also brought in Russ Tamblyn, who plays, remind me of his name?
Luke,
right. Brings in Luke. Luke is actually going to be inheriting Hill House, and so he's planning to make a tidy profit off of it. And then we have Nell/Eleanor, played by Julie Harris. And she is kind of someone of a delicate, emotional nature. And the reason Dr. Markway has recruited her is that she was kind of connected to a poltergeist event where stones fell on her roof when she was a child, which is interesting because I think that also is something that happens in Stephen King's Carrie.
Yes.
We have stones falling on the roof. So I think that King was definitely making an homage. I think this is also in the original Shirley Jackson Haunting of Hill House novel, although I haven't read that in long enough. I haven't read that recently enough to remember that. But anyway, so he's collected these 4 people to kind of, as almost like test subjects, to see how the house responds to them and how they respond to the house.
Right. And there is, Dr. Marquay is, he really wants this stuff to be true. He's kind of devoted his life to it. He's got a wife who shows up, much later in the picture, and you can tell that she's kind of tired of him kind of mucking about with his supernatural, experiments, and she doesn't believe in any of it. And she, very quickly learns the truth. Um, but yeah, as we were kind of talking about a bit ago, I think from a filmmaking standpoint, this is, unparalleled, from the production design to the special effects. I was doing some reading up on it. There's one
Mm,
scene where the main characters are kind of huddled in a parlor, and the door to the parlor begins bowing, it's not something trying to rattle the handle and get in. The
right.
door itself is bowing forward, and to read how they achieve that is just, it's phenomenal, and it's scary and it's intense. This movie, I think, to say the scares are punctuations. It's
Mm,
not your traditional haunted house movie, or a big, jump scare fest. It really does a great job of kind of easing you into the situation, creating a nice atmosphere, and then boom, something happens. Now, I don't think that's always consistently well done, because there are a handful of scenes where it definitely feels like, let's point the camera at this creepy, maybe creepy looking, well lit, tower, of the house, and then we'll put some voiceover and some eerie music over it. But it's just a static image of a piece of a building.
right. Well,
There are a number of those, but
well,
yeah.
so kind of a couple of things you mentioned. The remake, the 1999 remake, was kind of famous or infamous for showing us everything that the 1963 version did not. The 1963 version, you barely see anything in terms of actual supernatural events. In fact, the door bowing is really kind of like the big showcase moment where it's where we see something kind of uncanny. Everything else is kind of whispers and writing on walls in the night and just like little cold spots, things that don't necessarily feel. And this is why I think, maybe you're talking to things that don't necessarily feel cinematic. They feel like we are kind of like experiencing them, but almost at a distance. Like we can't feel the cold spots. We hear the whispering, but it doesn't feel like if you were in a house alone and you heard whispering. That said, when I first came to this film, probably like I was in my 30s, and I'd heard about it for many, many years. Its reputation certainly preceded it. And I got a copy from the library. I remember watching it alone at night, and I was just kind of knocked out by how quiet it is, but how the atmosphere really works its spell. We get these close-ups and we get these wonderful images speaking to, the evidence that the house is haunted. We have kind of a prologue where we hear about the various people who have fallen victim to the house. And there are just these great shots of like when Hugh Crane's wife, his new wife, dies just almost within eyesight of the house. And you referred to this earlier, the idea of the wheel, the carriage crashes and the wheels turning and the hand kind of falls in the frame. It's like there's these great images. There's another scene where a woman falls down the stairs and we get this great shot up at, the staircase and her head, right toward the camera.
It's
There's just
gruesome. Yeah.
these great images that kind of lead us into this is the house we're going to be spending the next 2 hours in. So are you ready?
Right, and the thing with the first Mrs. Crane dying in that carriage accident, it's not just that we see the spinning wheel and the hand fall into frame. It's that I think this is a happy accident or something, or maybe they just had this in mind. They just shot till they got it right. The hand falls into frame and stops and hangs with
Mm,
perfect symmetry of the arch of the wheel.
yeah.
It's maybe it's just an art nerd thing. I don't know, but I paused that when I was watching it. I was like, how did they do that? But yeah, and there's another bit where Abigail Crane, who was the daughter of Hugh Crane, she grew up never leaving the nursery,
Right. Right.
according to the legend. And there's this great, montage, in camera work of her growing from a little girl up into a
Right.
senior citizen, right?
Yeah.
it's not seamless, but it's, for 1963, it's very effective. And then you find out that it's the classic. Here's my Friday the 13th reference. The classic, she's in bed, she's she needs something, she's banging on the wall, but the lady who is attending to her is off fooling around with some suitor and
Right.
ignoring the poor Mrs. Abigail.
They weren't
And that
paying attention.
right. And Abigail wasn't a very good swimmer because she
No.
didn't leave the nursery. But
Right.
no, the attendant, she ends up hanging herself, I think, throwing herself off that
Which,
balcony.
again, another amazing shot.
Is this, I don't know, I'm always fascinated by cliches and cinematic language and where things come from.
Mm,
I've seen a half a dozen or more, maybe a dozen movies where someone hangs themselves and there's the one shoe that falls off. The other's
right.
like hanging there. I feel like did this movie invent that idea?
It
Because it's a
may,
great shot.
yeah, it may, I say, I definitely have seen that before, and I had the same thought this last time around. Going, I wonder if this was the first time, because what happens, and I think the reason why it's become kind of a cliche is that you get to see how far that shoe drops. Like the one shoe stays on the foot at kind of like, here's where we started, and then the shoe just drops down into space. But I just love, I remember seeing this. Now that we're talking about it, I know I saw a little snippet of this on like late night creature features when I was a little kid, and I remember turning it off because it was too scary after the scene of the woman falling down the stairs and this hanging business. I was like, I'm out. I can't do this. So I didn't even know what this film was until many years later when I watched it in its entirety. And I'm like, okay, I remember this now.
Yeah, it's a great prologue, and then we get into sort of the meat of the
And then it just
story.
gets boring for, an hour and
Hey,
40 minutes.
I didn't say it, but no,
But he
no,
will, folks.
it's frustrating because I love a good slow burn movie. I love an atmospheric horror movie. It's just that again, it comes down to what I'll call the filmmaking. When it comes to the sensational stuff, I think Wise really shines here. But then again, there are these other moments where it's supposed to be scary and creepy, and maybe it was in 1963. I kept having to
Mm-hmm.
refocus my brain. I'm like, this isn't scaring me, but I've seen a billion horror movies.
Right.
The people have probably been influenced by this and said, okay, Mr. Wise, here's how you shot this. Let me add some pizzazz or maybe an alternate angle or some edits to it.
Right.
But really, there are numerous scenes of just like a static shot of an object, and then they add something. They'll call it in post, like a sound effect or something like,
Mm-hmm.
ooh,
Mm-hmm.
scary. But then there are other moments that are genuinely terrifying. You mentioned there's kind of a lack of special effects. There's there is a moment where Eleanor is asleep in a room with
Yes.
Theo, and it's probably one of the most famous moments from this scene. The plaster wall, I guess the embossing on the texture of the wall. We get a close up of it, and she starts hearing whispers and laughter and like a little girl giggling. And you cut back to her, and it's the one time I think the internal monologue worked in her head
Mm.
because she's like, I'm going to open my mouth and scream. Whereas on the outside, she's just kind of like timid and whimpering. But when we get to look at that plaster, it just looks like regular kind of embossing, some like fleur-de-lis patterns, but then the light starts changing on it, and I swear there's a face in there.
Yep.
And I don't know if it's intentional or another happy accident, like, look, we captured a face, great, freeze on it. But whatever the case is, and it's not like a crazy demonic face, it's one of those things where the human brain can recognize, oh, this looks like an eye, that looks like an eye, that could be a mouth, it's a face, when
Mm-hmm.
really it's just an assemblage of angles in the right position.
Mm-hmm.
um, and she believes that she's cuddling in bed next to Eleanor, and not Eleanor, sorry, Theo, and she thinks that Theo is grabbing her hand, and she's like, you're breaking, I think she's breaking my hand, but I'm too frightened to even call out. When she finally does, she realizes that they're not even in the same bed, they're across the room from each other, so
Right.
who was grabbing my hand, that kind of a thing. And that really works. It's great.
Yeah, well, that's just it. I feel like there are a lot of those moments, and we have kind of a great uh ensemble of characters. We have our professor who wants to, or not professor, but our doctor who wants to figure things out. We have Theo, who's kind of this cool cosmopolitan, bisexual or lesbian, we're not sure which. And then we have Luke, who's kind of the disbelieving cool cat. And then we have Eleanor, who is, again, a very sensitive soul and a very sensitive, seems susceptible to the house. She is the one who is affected the most by the house.
Yeah, and this is the frustrating part of not pressing record earlier. Because we had this whole conversation that we are going to now recreate. And when it comes to my central, I think, problem with this movie is the lead actress's performance, Julie Harris. Now, in fairness to her, I think she does a great job with the material that she's given. It's just that at times she kind of falls into the hysterical woman cliche that I think is rather unfortunate, and is sort of in contrast. We see a lot of modern talk about the strong female character in movies, and I've always wondered, like, what's an example of a weak female character? Because I've watched a lot of old movies and things from eras and genres that people tend to criticize, and like there are plenty of examples of what we're looking for today in older films. But then I see this example, I'm like, oh, this is kind of what people are talking about. And it's inconsistent because at times she is very timid and a doormat, and other times she is very vindictive and spiteful. Neither mode is particularly endearing or interesting to me. And my issue is that I don't see where those clashing personalities meet to form an actual person that I might run into on the street. Whereas the other characters, I feel like, are well-rounded enough. Not to say that we get their full backstories or whatever, but I think they're at least believable and consistent in their modes. Even Theo, who at one point you had mentioned was this kind of a cool character, but then occasionally she'll get like really, spooked and freaked out.
Right.
I don't see that as an inconsistency. That is a person who is cool, calm, collected, running into something that they didn't believe was real and finding out that it is. And each of those characters gets that kind of moment in this movie. But yeah, with Nell, she's one thing or the other, and it kind of changes from scene to scene, and sometimes within the middle of a scene. And I found her to be grating, frankly. And I think if Theo had been the main character, I think that would have been really interesting, especially because, as you imply, she is. I think she is screamingly gay. And I'm not saying that it's like a criticism or anything, but I feel like it's almost like trying to do something subversive in 1963, but not being at all subtle about it. She doesn't explicitly say, "Hey, come here, now let's share a bed together," if you know what I mean. But there are these lines like Nell was all kind of wound up, and Theo says maybe just a little tight at the moment. Wow. But Nell, I think, is a supporting character at best, who I think if she had been having this breakdown in the context of other people kind of taking charge of the story, I would have enjoyed it more.
Sure. First off, I think the tight but I think tight is a euphemism for drunk.
Is it?
Yeah. So I think that's what she's referring to, because that's when they're both having, and Nell is not a drinker. So I think that's where that expression came from. But I think
maybe
I do, kind of to your point, I think the idea of Theo showing vulnerability is not something we normally see in movies. I think it's kind of like usually when we have a cool cat, they are a cool cat throughout. Like that is the color that they're going to be painting with. And so I really was refreshed by seeing Claire Bloom showing that vulnerability, showing that fear, when that's not what we would normally see, even 60 years later. To your criticism of Nell and or Julie Harris's performance. So I
would say again, I want to say just Nell. I think Julie Harris, I was annoyed by her performance, but I don't think that's anything that wasn't asked of her. That's the exact mode that was required for this version of this character.
Because I feel like she is a socially awkward person. I feel like that grating quality that you're referring to, I think that's kind of part of the deal. Like that's what you get when you get Nell. That doesn't mean you have to like her, but I feel like it's the right thing if we're going to be representing this character. She's somebody who lives, I mean, her bedroom is the living room of her sister's house.
Yes.
Like this is somebody who has not assimilated well into society. And so this idea that she is wanted elsewhere, is very appealing to her. And I think like that's why she falls under the spell of the house, and why, like she really likes feeling like she belongs there. There's also like this kind of fantasy that, Dr. Markway and she have feelings for each other. She certainly has feelings for him. I don't think that they are reciprocated. We see it in a kind of a kindly, like paternal way, but I don't get the sense that he is. I don't think that he is deliberately flirting with her to get her to, like he doesn't. I don't think he has designs on her.
I don't, but there this is almost like the plot of an entirely different movie that I'd love to watch. Um, right before Mrs. Marquay enters the picture, because she shows up late in the movie, she goes out to the house and she ends up spending the night there. She is totally not a believer and she doesn't support her husband's work, but she's like, "Well, I'm here and I'm going to stay for the night." But right before that scene, Nell had a real moment of like a freak out, a moment of vulnerability, and she confides in Dr. Marquay, and they end up kind of
Yeah.
not embracing, but like holding hands. And there's a moment there that, to your point, I don't think he was like really interested in her. But when we see Marquay, Mrs. Marquay,
Right.
and she's kind of like cold and like not that into her husband, it doesn't seem like. I look back on that scene between he and Nell, and I feel like he is responding to someone who actually needs him, actually has an
Hmm.
interest in him, and maybe he is attracted to that
Yeah.
need and that
He likes
vulnerability, not
being
in a predator. Right, but not
likes
in a
being
predatory
paternal. Yeah.
way.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, paternal maybe, but also sort of like, quasi-romantic, like,
Hmm.
this is a kind of affection that he hasn't gotten at home
Yes.
in a long time.
Yeah.
And I think that would've been, there's a deeper layer to this movie where I'm constantly wondering with these characters, how much of this is them and how much of it is the house?
Hmm.
And, I feel like I hate to say it, but if there'd been less focus on what was going on with Nell and her kind of hysteria, and more about playing those different shades with each of the characters, and them trying to break free of this spell, I think it would have been, and maybe this is in there and I just wasn't seeing it and I need to watch it again, perhaps on the big screen to get that.
Well, it's interesting because I think that is actually deliberate. I think that we are intended. Nelson Giddings, who did the screenplay, he talks on the commentary of how they went and actually visited Shirley Jackson, who had written the original novel, and because they wanted to just kind of like see, are they on the same track? And he said, I Nelson said, I think that this is not all really happening. I think this is all kind of happening in her mind, or at least a lot of it is happening in her mind. And it's not a story of a haunted house. It's a story of a person, like, basically having a mental breakdown. And Shirley Jackson apparently said, well, that's not what I had in mind, but that's really interesting. And I
That's
think
that's
that
that's a
is
bless your heart moment right there.
I think that is what Nelson Giddings and Robert Wise were going for. They're like, we want to leave it open, kind of similar to The Innocents, where we don't know what's actually happening. We're closely identifying. We're seeing most of the action through one character's lens, and it's a character who may or may not be reliable. I think her being awkward and being a little off-putting is by design. I think we're intended to be like, how sound is her mental state? And so when she has those flips, that seemed consistent with the character. That's like, this is somebody who is constantly emotionally striking out against anything that might try and shut her down in the way that she's been shut down. It seems like her entire life. Like she was left to care for her mother, her ailing mother, and she's finally free of that burden. And it's interesting how that mirrors uh, our our caretaker. Not It's not the caretaker, but as one of the in the prologue, one of the characters. Oh, it's the daughter of Hugh Crane
Abigail.
banging on the wall for the
Mhm.
caretaker, and the caretaker doesn't come. And in Nell's case, the mother was ringing the bell, and Nell was like, "No, I'm tired. I'm going to rest." And her mother dies that night. So it's like there's this kind of wonderful, weird, haunting mirror that occurs, and it just kind of further cements the idea that Eleanor believes she belongs here. She belongs in this house.
Yeah, and I think, as we had talked about earlier, with Stephen King and the obvious kind of reference to Carrie, whether it's deliberate or not, or
Right.
in Carrie, but King has famously written about possessed objects, possessed places that
Hmm.
send out their psychic tendrils to draw people in so they can take their sort of their spirit or their psychic energy and add it to its own kind of nefarious forces to make it more powerful to get more people, feeding the soul
Hmm.
machine. And that's the kind of the impression that I got here. I agree. There is, I can see that struggle in the screenplay versus the original novelist intent, kind of to a frustrating degree,
Hmm.
because at the end of the film, Nell ascends the staircase because she is determined to become part of the house. At one point, she's kind of dancing around, being serenaded by, the music of the house, I guess, or whatever's
Right.
in her own mind. She ascends the staircase. Dr. Marquay comes after her. And that's a really thrilling scene because you don't know, is she
Yeah.
going to make it up? Is he going to make it up? Are they both going to fall down together? And the result is very surprising. If you haven't seen The Haunting, I will leave that as a mystery.
Great.
But at one point, Nell looks up and she sees what she believes is the zombified, ghostly form of Mrs. Marquay kind of popping out of a laundry chute or something like that.
And the ceiling.
And and the ceiling, and it scares her. And then later, like a few minutes later, they're all outside the house, and Nell is about to be escorted home by Luke because they're like, "Look, you're flipping out. We have to get you away from this house because whether it's haunted or not, it is obviously some kind of a trigger for whatever's going on in your head." She commandeers the car when Luke gets out to go check on something and starts driving away. And this is a point of contention, I know, between you and I. But she starts driving, kind of like a possessed person. And in her mind, she's going through, Mrs. Marquay shouldn't have been, she didn't deserve to be part of the house. That was my spot. The house wants me.
Right.
And so she's driving and driving, and that's going through her head. And all of a sudden, the car kind of takes control. You see the steering wheel moving on its own, and the acceleration picks up, and she ends up driving into the tree and dying. In that last moment, she sees Mrs. Marquay kind of dashing across the headlights in this white gown. And at the end, once everything is resolved, Mrs. Marquay comes out of the woods, and you realize she wasn't a ghost. She had just gotten kind of like turned around and spit out of the house, which is an interesting idea, but it's also kind of a cop out. I'm like, do you want me to think it's a ghost, or is this real? But it really is ghosts, as we see in the kind of the epilogue, as we get Eleanor's voiceover, which I think is a great way to end the film.
Hmm.
That closing line is, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it, but it's, "We who walk here walk alone,"
Yep.
which is ironic because you get the feeling that Eleanor has only wanted ever to belong somewhere and to find her people, and her people are now ghosts, but she doesn't really interact with them because she's
Right.
in a solitary house filled with ghosts, which is a fascinating idea. But yeah, you had contended that you didn't think that she was driving to commit suicide. I don't think it was as deliberate as that. I think she wanted to become part of the house, and she saw driving into the tree as like her gateway to that. So I
Mm.
was confused when she's driving and the car takes over, and then she's like, "Wait, this isn't what I wanted." I'm like, "Well, what is it?"
Right. Well, and I think I think she wanted to be, I don't know that it crossed her mind that killing herself would allow her to become part of the house. What we do hear later from Mrs. Markway is that no, it wasn't that it swerved to avoid her. Like it was always heading right for that tree. Uh, and uh, and so that's kind of to your point. It's like, did the did the did the house kill her or did she kill herself? And I think those are things that are deliberately left ambiguous, as is a lot of the events that happen in the film. The idea of things being, are they real? Are they not? Is this happening or is this all in Nell's mind? I would say, by and large, I think it is all really happening. Like, I want to
Yeah.
believe it's actually a haunted house. I don't think it is as ambiguous as, say, like The Innocents, where we're like, well, it could be A or it could be B, because there's so many times where we have all the characters in one place kind of experiencing the same thing, which is not the case for The Innocents. Usually, like Ms. Giddings is experiencing this when nobody else is.
Right. And I think I do like that again, that the term punctuation, like when we do get the evidence that there is something going on in the house, like with the bowed door, or the kind of the chilling, the cold pockets, the noises that the group experiences in the parlor, kind of like stomping around, in the walls and then the ceilings, and they realize, oh my God, they're going towards, because of course, Mrs. Markway, she stomps into the house and she's like, "What's the most haunted
Mhm.
part of this place? Oh, the nursery. I'm gonna
I'll go
spend the
stay
night
there.
there."
Yeah.
Right? They're like, "At least let us keep the door open." She's like, "No." And I did I flash back to one of our previous conversations. If you'll notice, the archway inside the nursery says "Suffer little children" over and
That's
over again.
I absolutely thought of that. Uh, so I just really quick because it's been playing in my head, and I want to make sure I actually say it.
Yeah,
Mrs. Markway is played by Lois Maxwell, who went on to be Mrs. Moneypenny for the majority of the Bond series. That
that
is, yep, that is
that
she.
explains it. Okay, I was like, where do I know her from?
Well,
Wow.
and the fun irony of it is that Richard Johnson was actually one of the lead contenders to play James Bond for the original Doctor No, and it was like him and Sean Connery kind of neck and neck, and they went with Sean Connery because they wanted kind of the rougher around the edge quality, whereas Richard Johnson would have played very much like the guy who'd gone to finishing school and was the upper crust and knew the difference between shaken and stirred, etc. But yeah, it's funny to see like what could have been Bond with Mrs. Moneypenny.
Richard Johnson is more of a, I think he's a fine actor in this movie. I peg him more as like a Q, or a government, an MI6 advisor or
Yeah.
something to give Bond the mission. Yeah, that's the frustrating thing about this film, and I'm glad we're talking about it and we're kind of hashing things out. But it's one of those occasions where I feel like it's almost unfair of me to discuss it because I haven't. Maybe I'll never get it, but I do need to see it at least once more, to see maybe this isn't for me, or maybe I'm just not open to it
Yeah, could be.
right now.
And have you seen the Netflix series?
No, but I've heard great things about it. I've heard one detail that made me really want to see it, but there's 1,000 different shows to watch.
Sure.
Maybe you've seen it, I assume.
I've not seen it actually, and so I'm
No.
I'm I'm curious to kind of sit down with it, uh, having this one so close in the memory to see how it kind of shores up. Uh,
Well,
because
babe,
I wonder if they do the kind of if it's a pure straight ahead haunting, which seems kind of in keeping with what Mrs. Jackson said during her conversation with Nelson Gidding, or if there is that hint of ambiguity.
well, we do have a scarathon coming up in a few months, so maybe we'll do that as a special episode. But no, what I had heard about the Netflix show that really intrigued me was that there are almost like Where's Waldo ghosts kind of as part of the environment of the house.
Uh-huh.
So you'll be like watching, say, I'm going based on what I've read, so this could be totally inaccurate, but like if
Right.
there's a panning shot across like the living room, if you rewind, you'll notice, oh, there's actually a person standing there.
Mm,
like it's a ghost that's literally blended into the environment. Not that
sure.
it does anything, but just kind of adds to the idea that the entire fiber of this place is possessed. So that was something that was really intriguing to me. And I think that's maybe intentional or not, but that's sort of what we were going back to with that plaster relief on the wall.
Mhm.
The face in there, is that deliberate, or is she just seeing things?
Well, and I mean, what you're describing, Rick, gives me the heebie-jeebies because I'm thinking, like, is it like The Exorcist, the version you've never seen, where you see like the Where's Waldo popping up of Pazuzu, because that annoyed the crap out of me. So I'm hoping that isn't the case, or at least that it's more subtle than that.
For what because people were talking about it a lot when that series came out, so I'm getting the feeling that it's the subtle, the creepy, effective version of what you're talking
Good.
about, not oh my God, that version of The Exorcist. Let's never speak of that again.
It's the
Wow.
version you never wanted to see. Uh,
Right.
Now, kind of going back to the idea, I mean, really, we don't see a lot of anything in this film. And that's one of the things I liked about it, is that it is all kind of weird voices, and we talk about cold spots and the idea of somebody holding your hand, that isn't there. But it is all things that are almost like talked about without really seeing. And maybe that's what is contributing to your negative experience to it, is that it doesn't feel very cinematic. I think it does kick things up a notch, toward the end when we have, all the noises going on and we have the door stretching and we have them going up the staircase where things just ramp up considerably.
I think there is something to that because it's inconsistent for me in that there are two or three scenes where the actors or the characters encounter cold spots in the house, and a couple of those, I think one of them stood out as like, oh, I get it. That really does feel like people who are walking. All of a sudden, they come into this cold pocket. I've experienced something similar to that in a house that I felt like something was going on, and I
Mm.
watched that scene in this movie. I'm like, oh, that's real. In other cases, it felt like the actors are all walking down the hallway. Okay, this is where we stop and grab our shoulders and shiver because, ooh, it's a cold spot.
Hmm.
There's just a lot that felt. Uh, I think there's more effective use of performance and effects and cinematography in this movie than there are not. But those couple of instances that don't work for me really stand out as like, this could have done with another take or another angle or approach.
What is your feeling about kind of the look of the film? Because I was watching it, and I don't know if it was because I was watching it on DVD, but like the innocence is such, like the cinematography is so, the wonderful contrast of black and white and shadow. This one feels a little muddier, in that it just feels like everything's just kind of like a little less distinct in terms of the sharp lines.
That I understand that. I think it's selective. I mean, there are a couple
Hmm.
of really nice contrasty scenes. There's one where there's like a cherub statue in the extreme foreground with the creepy, like the eyes are open, like it's kind of dreamily looking up, but when seen at night in like the moonlight hitting it, it looks really sinister.
Mm.
But there's a lot going on in Hill House in terms of like the clutter and the stuff. So
Yeah.
I think it's kind of hard in those situations to come up with a distinctive like composition. Like this is what you're supposed to be focusing on because there's so many tchotchkes and old furniture and decorations and patterns and stuff in the background that it's like, oh, it's just kind of amorphous.
We're going to be tackling Legend of Hell House later on this year, and I'm genuinely curious to see what your response to that is, because I think it's a much more it's based off of Hell House, which was written by Richard Matheson as a response
Oh,
to Shirley Jackson's Haunting of Hill House, where he's like, there's not going to be any question about whether or not this is a haunted house. This is the Mount Everest of haunted houses. And so and I think the film does a similar job of kind of like just taking you right up to the edge and putting things in your face.
well, you said Richard Matheson. Those are, much like Robert Wise, those are magic words to me. So I'm
Yep.
very intrigued. Well, again, this movie didn't work its spell on me quite. This is the most enjoyable attempt I've had at it, but it still took me 3 tries to get through it. I'm gonna try and make that show in August. Put the information, send it to me, and we'll put it down below.
Yep.
But yeah, thanks for talking about this with me. My feelings are much more generous towards it now than they were at the start of this, but still didn't knock me out quite. But AC, where can people find your stuff? What are you up to?
Oh, well, please stop on by. We have our Friday Night Frights every week on YouTube over at Horror 101 with Dr. AC. And we've got a couple of other little things that we throw in over on that channel, but the Friday Night Frights are kind of the main attraction. So stop on by. I think this week we're going to be premiering our 40th anniversary of Sleepaway Camp and all of its sequels, which is a load of fun. And then we've got some good stuff coming up. We've got Creep Show. We're going to talk about the Quatermass movies, both the film versions and also the original teleplays. So yeah, swing on by. Love to have you.
Well, and I gotta say, a plug for the show you did last week, the Twilight Zone, the movie
Oh, yeah.
retrospective for the 40th anniversary. That was a great show and a great panel. So
Thank you.
folks should definitely check that out, along with everything else that he mentioned. But that in particular, I was like, wow, that's a you had some great knowledgeable guests doing kind of deep dives into the history of the movie and the kind of the fraught, the controversies, also some of the kind of the alternate history, and yeah, it was just a really rich discussion.
Thank you. Well, I model my show after yours. I'm not too proud to say. So thank you for inspiring me on so many levels.
Well, thank you, sir. But and also happy birthday again,
Yes.
folks. If you
Happy
want to
birthday.
give both of us a great present, go and subscribe to both of our channels if you're already not, and give us a like and all that good stuff. And join us back next month. We'll be continuing our journey beyond Hammerland. Yeah, until then, till next time. I don't know what we're talking about. I'm not going to pull up the spreadsheet because I think that's kind of cheating. But yeah, we'll be back. Enjoy the rest of June, which is just a few hours from now to enjoy it. I'm going to stop talking because I'm rambling. This has been The Haunting, 1963, 60 years of, horror goodness, I guess. Classic filmmaking. I don't know. I love Robert
Wow.
Wise.
Way to sell it. Way to sell it in the last moments.
I know. I'm sorry. Anyway, thanks. Take care, and we'll catch you later.